The year is 1846. The air over Sault Ste. Marie is thick with the scent of damp cedar and the metallic tang of impending blood. In the historical records of the Michigan Territory, this is the moment the veil finally tore. We find a man, 76 years old, his skin leathered by 60 winters in the subarctic wilderness, standing on the precipice of a final, desperate disappearance. But to understand the shadow he cast, we must look back to the day the sun went out for a 9-year-old boy on the banks of the Ohio River in 1789. This was not just a kidnapping, it was the systematic erasure of a cultural identity, a process the Shawnee and later the Ojibwe performed with the cold efficiency of the natural world. The harsh reality of the late 18th century meant that the frontier was not a line on a map, but a shifting, violent wound. For young John Tanner, the crucial threshold was crossed the moment a Shawnee war party pulled him from his father's cornfield. Historically, these captures were often a ritualized form of mourning, replacing a lost tribesman with a captive child. As the boy was dragged into the deep woods, the English language began to rot in his mouth, replaced by the rhythmic guttural cadences of the Algonquian tongues. He was no longer a son of Kentucky. He was a vessel to be filled with the spirit of the woods. But in 1846, that vessel is breaking. John Tanner is accused of a murder he likely did not commit, the assassination of James Schoolcraft. He stands in his small, lonely cabin, hearing the approach of a lynch mob. For a man who survived the starvation winters of the Red River, where men ate their own moccasins to stay alive, the fear of a bullet is nothing compared to the agony of being misunderstood. He is a man who knows every secret of the forest, yet he is a stranger in his own skin. He realizes that in the eyes of the white man, he is a savage beyond redemption. And in the eyes of the native, he is a Kitchi-moko-man, a long knife, a white man whose blood remains an indelible stain. Historical documents from this era describe Tanner at this moment as a wild man, a spectre with eyes that had seen too much frost and too much fire. He is trapped in the ultimate threshold, the space between two civilizations that both demand his disappearance. The psychological weight of this isolation is staggering. He is a master hunter who can track a deer through a blizzard, yet he cannot find a path back to humanity. As the torches of the search party flicker through the pines, Tanner prepares to vanish. This is the moment where the man of the woods must decide if he belongs to the earth or the memory of the people who hate him. Before we dive deeper into the archives of the past, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? To understand the sheer magnitude of Tanner's endurance, we must examine the tools of his survival and the rituals of the Ojibwe that kept him breathing when the world wanted him dead. We must look into the archive of life that he carried in his scarred hands. To truly grasp the existence of John Tanner, one must look past the romanticized legends of the White Indian and peer into the grit and bone of the late 18th century Great Lakes. The archive of his life was not written in ink, but in the calluses of his palms and the scars on his shins. Historical records from the 1790s and early 1800s reveal a landscape of brutal beauty, where the Ojibwe and Ottawa tribes didn't just inhabit the land, they were an extension of its metabolic cycle. For Tanner, survival was a meticulous daily labor, a history of the everyday that defined his very marrow. The transition from a Kentucky farm boy to a master of the northern woodlands was a violent re-education. In the archive of life, we see the tools of a forgotten era. The curved birch-bark canoe, the hand-forged iron traps of the Northwest Company, and the indispensable makak, the birch-bark containers used for everything from storing maple sugar to carrying the embers of a fire. Tanner's daily reality was dictated by the seasons. In the spring, it was the sugar bush, where he learned the sacred alchemy of the maple tree. In the winter, it was the long hunt, a desperate pursuit of moose and elk through snow so deep it could swallow a horse. The harsh reality of the 1800s meant that a single mistake, a snapped snowshoe lace or a damp powder horn, was a death sentence. Tanner became a virtuoso of these details. He recorded in his own narratives how he would track animals for days through the sub-zero barrens of the Red River Valley, his lungs burning with the white frost of the north. He learned the Ojibwe medicine, the use of willow bark for pain and spruce resin for wounds. His body became a map of the frontier's cruelty. He was once shot and left for dead, only to crawl through the brush, packing his own wounds with forest moss to stem the tide of his life's blood. However, the archive of life contains more than just physical survival. It contains the weight of a borrowed culture. Tanner was adopted by Netno Kwa, an Ottawa matriarch of formidable power and legendary status. Under her tutelage, he didn't just learn to hunt, he learned the spiritual geography of the Great Lakes. He participated in the Miduvivin, the Grand Medicine Society, understanding the world as a place populated by Manitus, powerful spirits residing in the stones, the rapids, and the wind. Yet, there was a haunting dissonance in his domestic life. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of the captive. He was a man who spoke Ojibwe with the nuance of a poet, but looked in the mirror and saw the face of the Long Knives, who were systematically displacing his adopted family. He wore the buckskin leggings and the vermilion face paint of a warrior, but his blue eyes remained a biological betrayal. He was a keeper of indigenous wisdom, who could never fully escape the phantom of the boy he used to be, the boy who remembered the smell of his mother's bread and the sound of a church bell. This phase of his life was a constant accumulation of sensory archives. The sound of the tom-tom during a winter ceremony, the tactile roughness of a beaver pelt being stretched on a frame, and the metallic scent of the fur trade outposts where he was treated as a curiosity, a white savage to be poked and prodded by European travelers. He was a living bridge between two worlds, but the bridge was beginning to crack under the weight of a changing continent. The fur trade was dying, the game was disappearing, and the great hunger was always lurking just beyond the tree line. As the 1820s approached, Tanner began to feel the closing of the frontier. The archive of life was becoming a ledger of loss. The forests were being felled, and the ancient migration routes of his people were being severed by the surveyor's chain. He was a man who knew the name of every plant in the woods, yet he found himself increasingly unable to name a place where he truly belonged. As we delve into the middle years of John Tanner's life, we encounter a void that no amount of woodcraft could fill. This is the psychological isolation, the internal wilderness of a man who belonged to two worlds and therefore belonged to none. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of the borderlands, where identity was often a matter of life or death. By the 1820s, Tanner was no longer the malleable child of the Shawnee. He was a grown man, a father, and a hunter of legendary repute. Yet he existed in a state of permanent mental exile. Historical records from the fur trade era, including the journals of explorers like David Thompson, paint a picture of the white Indian as a figure of deep, brooding melancholy. The isolation was not merely geographic, though he spent months in the silent, frozen expanses of the Assiniboine and Red River regions. It was profoundly existential. In the indigenous camps, he was Shaw-Shaw-Wa-Nebase, the falcon, a name that spoke to his predatory skill. But beneath the charcoal war paint, there was the Kitchi-moko-man, big knife. The Ojibwe, despite adopting him, never fully forgot his origins. During times of tribal tension or scarce resources, the white blood in his veins became a convenient scapegoat for the community's misfortunes. He was watched with a lingering, silent distrust, a man whose loyalty was always under the microscope of the council fires. Conversely, when Tanner attempted to re-engage with the white world, the psychological blow was even more devastating. He was treated as a biological specimen, a reverted human who had lost the light of civilization. To the white settlers and the military officers at Sault Ste. Marie, he was a linguistic bridge to be used and then discarded. He sat in their parlors, feeling the suffocating constriction of wool clothes and the jarring rigidity of their social hierarchies. The harsh reality of the 1820s meant that a man like Tanner was a living contradiction to the doctrine of manifest destiny. If a white man could become a savage, then the entire moral justification for Western expansion was at risk. Thus, they needed him to be a villain or a fool. They could not allow him to be a peer. This isolation manifested in a profound irritability and a hair-trigger defensive mechanism. He lived in a state of hypervigilance, a psychological condition common among those who survive prolonged captivity and frontier warfare. Every rustle in the undergrowth was a potential assassin. Every whispered conversation in the trading post was a conspiracy against his life. He began to believe that his own people, both white and native, were poisoning his path. This was the true breaking of the spirit. He was a master of the physical woods, but he was drowning in the psychological thicket of paranoia. The weight of this isolation was compounded by the loss of his family. His marriages to indigenous women were fraught with the same cultural friction that defined his life. He struggled to reconcile the patriarchal expectations of his Kentucky roots with the matrilineal and fluid social structures of the Great Lakes tribes. He found himself a stranger in his own lodge, unable to fully communicate the depth of his displacement to his wives or his children, who saw the world through eyes that had never known the white man's God or the white man's fences. To analyze the impact of this geographic and social isolation is to witness the slow erosion of a human soul. Tanner began to record his memoirs with the help of Dr. Edwin James, a U.S. Army surgeon. These sessions were not mere storytelling. They were an autopsy of a living man. Tanner spoke of the long nights where the wind sounded like the voices of the dead, and the crushing realization that if he died in the woods, there was no one who would truly know which version of him had perished. He was the ghost of the border, a man who had mastered the art of being invisible to others, only to find that he had become invisible to himself. The year is 1846, and the humid summer air of Sault Ste. Marie is about to ignite. This is the breaking point, the moment where the friction between John Tanner's two identities produces a spark that consumes everything he has left. To understand this climax, we must look at the forgotten customs of frontier justice, a volatile mix of rumor, racial prejudice, and the desperate need for a scapegoat. Tanner, now an old man of 76, is no longer the falcon of the plains. He is a pariah, a specter of the woods, living in a small, weathered cabin on the outskirts of a town that fears him. The catalyst for the explosion was the murder of James Schoolcraft, the brother of the powerful Indian agent Henry Rowe Schoolcraft. James was shot from ambush, a classic frontier assassination. In the eyes of the townspeople, there was only one man capable of such a savage act, the man who lived like an Indian but shared the skin of a white man. The historical records of the Michigan Territory show that the suspicion against Tanner was instantaneous and lacks the rigor of modern forensics. He was convicted by the court of public opinion before a single shell casing was found. But for Tanner, this was the final betrayal of the white world. He had tried to integrate. He had worked as an interpreter. He had shared his life story with scholars. Yet, at the first sign of blood, he was cast back into the role of the treacherous captive. The psychological isolation we explored in Phase 3 now manifests as a physical siege. On July 4th, 1846, a day ironically celebrating independence, Tanner's cabin was set ablaze. The scene is raw and cinematic, the crackle of dry cedar catching fire, the orange glow reflecting in the eyes of a man who has survived massacres and starvation, and the shouts of a mob that represents the civilization he once tried to reclaim. Tanner does not plead. He does not cry out. He retreats into the one place where he has always been king, the impenetrable darkness of the swamp. As his meager possessions, the tools of his survival and the records of his life, turn to ash, Tanner vanishes into the brush with the silence of a ghost. The breaking point is not just the fire, it is the total severance of his tether to humanity. He becomes a hunter once more, but this time he is the prey. For days, a massive manhunt combed the woods. Soldiers from Fort Brady and local volunteers pushed through the dense undergrowth, their muskets cocked, expecting a confrontation with a monster. They found his tracks, they found his discarded blankets, but they never found the man. The savage skills that the townspeople mocked were the very things that allowed him to slip through their fingers like smoke. This was his final act of defiance. By refusing to be captured, by refusing to give the white man the satisfaction of a hanging, Tanner reclaimed his agency. He chose the woods over the gallows. He chose the silence of the forest over the lies of the courtroom. The gravity of this moment defines an era where the frontier was being tamed by fire and blood. John Tanner's disappearance remains one of the great cold cases of American history, a man who was erased by the very world that claimed to have rescued him. The smoke eventually cleared from the charred remains of John Tanner's cabin, but the atmosphere in Sault Ste. Marie remained thick with a suffocating, paranoid silence. This is the historical aftermath. The period where a man's life is distilled into a cautionary tale and a series of cold bureaucratic entries. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of frontier justice. When a suspect vanishes, the community does not seek the truth. They seek a closure that fits their prejudices. Historical records from the weeks following July 1846 show a town gripped by Tannerphobia. Mothers kept their children indoors, and men traveled in pairs, convinced that the white Indian was lurking in the shadows of every cedar swamp, a vengeful phantom with a sharpened knife. But as the days turned into months, the frantic manhunts yielded nothing but empty campsites and cold ashes. John Tanner had not just run away, he had been reabsorbed by the earth. Like the Ottawa and Ojibwe warriors who taught him, he knew that the best way to defeat an enemy was to become a part of the landscape they feared. The harsh reality of the mid-19th century was that Tanner's disappearance provided a convenient villain for the Schoolcraft murder, but history would eventually whisper a different truth. Years later, evidence surfaced suggesting that James Schoolcraft was actually murdered by an army officer named Lieutenant Tilden over a personal grudge. The savage Tanner had been framed by a civilized soldier. This revelation serves as a devastating postscript to Tanner's life. It proves that despite his decades of survival in the frozen north, his greatest threat was never a wolf or a blizzard. It was the calculated treachery of the world he was born into. To analyze the aftermath of Tanner's exile is to witness the great erasure of the frontier. Shortly after he vanished, the United States intensified its removal policies. The very tribes that had raised Tanner were being pushed further west or confined to tiny fragments of their ancestral lands. Tanner's story became a metaphor for the middle ground that was rapidly disappearing. There was no longer room for a man who spoke two languages and carried two hearts. The American identity was hardening into a binary. You were either a pioneer or an obstacle. What remained of John Tanner? a few weathered artifacts, a fragmented reputation, and his narrative of captivity and adventures, which remains one of the most significant ethnographic documents of the era. Scholars today rely on his accounts to understand the intricate social structures of the Ojibwe before they were shattered by westward expansion. Tanner, in his involuntary exile, became an accidental historian. He preserved a world that was being systematically destroyed, even as that world was destroying him. The historical aftermath reveals a man who died as he lived, in the in-between. His body was never found. Some say he froze in a lonely thicket. Others believe he found his way back to the remote bands of the Rainy Lake region to die among the only people who ever truly called him son. He left behind a legacy of absolute resilience and absolute displacement. He was the man who survived the starvation winters, only to starve for a sense of belonging in a country that had no name for him. As we close the heavy ledger on the life of John Tanner, we are left not with a hero's monument, but with a haunting resonance that lingers over the Great Lakes. To look back at the Falcon is to look into a mirror of the American soul, divided, displaced, and perpetually searching for a home that no longer exists. The legacy of John Tanner is a tribute to the sheer, stubborn will of a human being to survive the impossible, even when the price of that survival is the loss of one's own shadow. Historical analysis of the 19th century frontier often focuses on the conquerors or the conquered, but Tanner occupied the painful, jagged space in between. He was a living archive of a world that was being systematically erased. Through his narrative, he preserved the nuances of the Ojibwe language, the complex protocols of the fur trade, and the raw, unvarnished reality of tribal warfare and family life in the North. He gave a voice to a culture that the burgeoning United States was trying to silence, and in doing so, he became an accidental guardian of a heritage that was not originally his own. The philosophical weight of Tanner's life lies in his relentless resilience. He was a man who was kidnapped, beaten, shot, starved, and ultimately framed for a crime he did not commit. Yet he never broke until the world itself became unrecognizable to him. His story forces us to confront a difficult truth, that civilization is often defined by those who are the most adept at exclusion. Tanner was too Indian for the white men and too white for the Indians. He was a man of the woods in an age of fences. Today, the thick forests of Sault Ste. Marie and the winding rivers of the Red River Valley hold his secrets. There are no gravestones for John Tanner, no statues in the town squares. His monument is the silence of the cedar swamps and the enduring strength of the stories he left behind. He reminds us that the history of the frontier was not just a series of battles and treaties, but a deeply personal struggle for identity in a land that was changing faster than the human heart could follow. To remember John Tanner is to honor the man who belonged nowhere, acknowledging that his struggle is a part of our collective DNA. He was the bridge that collapsed, the fire that was smothered, and the hunter who finally found peace in the only place that never demanded he change, the wild, indifferent earth. His life was a testament to the fact that while bodies can be captured and names can be changed, the spirit of the wilderness, once invited in, can never truly be evicted. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us at Wildbound History. If you believe these stories of resilience must never be forgotten, hit the like button and subscribe for our next historical journey. Until next time, stay wild.